Thanks for tuning in to Arirang's Within the Frame, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Han-Daeun. The South Korea-Africa Summit, the largest multilateral gathering to be hosted by the Yoon administration, is now less than a week away. Nearly 50 countries are expected to take part to discuss ways to deepen cooperation in the economic sector and beyond. The summit comes as the global race heats up to earn Africa's trust for various partnerships, with many recognizing that close cooperation with the mother continent is not just an option, but an imperative. On today's Within the Frame, we explore the significance of the South Korea-Africa Summit, Korea's strategy in engaging African markets, and the challenges that lie ahead. For some insights, Choi Hyun-jin, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kyunghee University, joins us in the studio. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
For another perspective on the topic, Ben KATOKA, Assistant Professor of African Studies at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, also joins us via Zoom. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Professor Che, I want to start with you. So South Korea will host a summit with African nations next week as part of its efforts to boost cooperation with the Global South. First, tell us about the significance.
Okay, this upcoming conference between Korea and Africa will be our first major conference with the African countries, and President Yoon Suk-yeol will participate and also hold individual meetings with the African leaders. So this event is said to be the biggest of its kind since President Yoon's government started, with more than 45 countries expected to send their representative. And since taking office, the Yoon administration has focused on strengthening ties with the Global South, including Africa. And this year's summit with Africa aims to deepen this strategic partnership with the Global South. And this summit will focus on enhancing cooperation with African nations in politics, economy, and also social issues. And it will help Korea build stronger global economic ties in important areas like natural resources, infrastructure, renewable energy, and also technology. And especially Africa is so important nowadays because it has a wealth of important minerals. So for example, Zimbabwe is Africa's leading producer of lithium, while the Democratic Republic of Congo holds the most cobalt globally. And in addition, Eastern African countries like Burundi and Tanzania have large nickel deposit. So I hope this event will serve as an opportunity for South Korea to enhance our global economic security network with the African countries.
Well, the Yoon administration has been making vigorous efforts to elevate South Korea's relations with African nations to levels not seen before, and these efforts are expected to culminate in the summit. And as you mentioned, President Yoon will hold bilateral summits with heads of states from 25 countries. So we're pinning high hopes on the big gathering. And Professor KATOKA, 48 African nations, that's the updated number that we just got, have expressed their will to take part in the upcoming South Korea-Africa Summit. The answer to this question may vary depending on each country, but generally speaking, what are the expectations of participating countries and their key areas of interest?
Well, it's just like you said, expectations depend, from country to country. However, I think there are areas in which African countries are expecting to gain from the cooperation with South Korea. So, for example, according to some recent estimates from the World Bank, more than 100 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. So in that sense, I think that is an area in which Korea's, technology and Africa's huge reserves of critical, the so-called critical minerals can synergize. So Korea, for example, could invest in building, the downstream industries, for example, to build batteries and, solar energy to deliver, energy to African countries. So I think that is one area in which African countries are expecting to gain from this summit. And besides, just to build from what my predecessor said, I think the summit is significant in two ways, and I think that is important to mention. From Korea's perspective, I would say that this summit is a capstone of a long process that started with President Roh Moo-hyun in 2006, when Korea established the Korea's Initiative for Africa's Development. So having this high-level meeting more than 17 years later is definitely meaningful for South Korea. But on the other hand, from Africa's perspective, the significance of the meeting, in my view, would depend on the outcomes of the meeting. Let's not forget that Africa already has more than 10 formal partnerships with external partners like China, Turkey, India, Russia, and so on. So what it is that the summit between Korea and Africa will bring to the table of economic development in Africa, that is a big question that we need to answer.
Yes, the competition is fierce, and we'll talk more about that as we move on. From my understanding, South Korea holds a special place, though, in Africa, as the continent is eagerly looking to learn from Korea's experience of rapid economic growth, rising from colonialism and war. And the main goal, of course, is to unleash Africa's untapped economic potential, which brings us to our next question. Professor KATOKA, with a population of 1.4 billion and a wealth of natural resources, Africa is considered the world's last growth engine that can save the global economy. Could you elaborate on the immense potential and what's driving the so-called African growth miracle?
Well, just like you said, Africa has huge reserves of the so-called critical minerals like copper, cobalt, and nickel. But at the same time, the problem is that African countries tend to focus on the export of raw minerals, and that is a problem, and it's not helping African countries to truly, benefit from their vast amount of natural wealth. So take the example of a country like DR Congo, for example. So Congo possesses more than 70% of reserves of cobalt. And in the past years, Congo exported almost 100% of its export to China. And China, on the other hand, is kind of controlling the entire value chain from, production of raw minerals to the processing of those minerals. And I believe that that is also, as I said earlier, an area in which Africa should, build its cooperation with South Korea, in the sense of building downstream industries that would help African countries process, their natural resources. So that is one. On the other hand, Africa has huge potential in terms of its size. So African countries combined represent a population of more than 1 billion people, and that represents a huge consumer market for Korean product, and I believe that South Korea will take definitely advantage of that. And also with the current process of integration in the region, African economies combined will represent a GDP of about $3 billion, which is also quite significant, and it will place Africa as, I think, among the top 10 economies in the world. And I think that South Korea should definitely take advantage of that market.
So there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about Africa's future, and many are betting that Africa will become the next China. Now, Professor Che, looking back in history, there have always been power rivalries in Africa, and recently India and Turkey are vying to increase their geopolitical footprint across the continent. Can you tell us more about this fierce competition among major economies to win the hearts of African nations?
Yes, many countries are competing for influence in Africa nowadays because of its strategic significance and abundant natural resources. And as you just mentioned, India and Turkey are especially active nowadays. For example, India is strengthening its relationship with Africa through partnership in economics, military, and technology. So it is concentrating on projects that build local capacities using its historical and colonial connections with the continent. And this India's strategy is mostly about soft power, emphasizing collaboration in healthcare, education, and also IT. On the other hand, Turkey has also boosted its diplomatic and economic roles in Africa. Since early 2000s, making major investments in infrastructures like airports and transport networks. It has also expanded Turkish airline services to connect more African cities. And also Turkey is promoting itself as a cultural and also humanitarian ally of African countries. So these efforts have somehow promoted infrastructure development and also investment in Africa. However, so they also pose some challenges to African countries. So there are growing concerns about rising debt levels and also political influence and also environmental damage from big mining and construction projects. So African nations are becoming more conscious of these negative issues, and they are trying to use their position to get the most benefit while keeping their independence.
The U.S. and China are no exception. The two superpowers are also stepping up efforts to deepen their ties with Africa, with Chinese President Xi Jinping recently elevating China's relations with key African nations to a strategic partnership, while U.S. President Joe Biden has named Kenya as a major U.S. ally, which is quite rare. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, the U.S. and China are both actively working to strengthen their ties with Africa. And China is, I think, the biggest player in Africa nowadays, making large investments in infrastructure, mining, and also agriculture through its Belt and Road Initiative. So this program is focusing on constructing important infrastructure and providing loans for development projects to secure China's robust presence on the continent. On the other hand, the United States has traditionally focused on foreign aid and military support in Africa, but nowadays it is shifting its focus towards more boosting trade and private investment. The so-called Prosper Africa Initiative is a part of this new focus of the United States for promoting American private sector investments in Africa to somehow counterbalance China's expanding influence on the continent. So this competition between the U.S. and China somehow driven by both strategic and also economic motivation. So both countries are eager to access Africa's abundant natural resources, such as oil and precious metals, to bolster their economies. And moreover, increasing their influence in Africa can improve both countries' diplomatic positions on the global stage. So, because strong ties with African countries may help garner a more support in international settings, such as UN, which is so important for shaping worldwide policies. And I expect that this rivalry is expected to continue in the future because both superpowers are competing for a more dominant role in the African continent.
So the two superpowers, as well as advanced economies, as well as emerging economies, are all dipping their toes in Africa in their quest for economic and strategic presence in the region. But as you pointed out, I think it's also just as important to make sure that Africa is not exploited in any way. We should also make efforts to mitigate the possible negative implications and also provide adequate benefits to local populations as well. Now, Professor KATOKA, African countries are no longer just recipients of foreign aid, but essential partners for many countries. But some say that economic benefits from collaborating with African nations still remain relatively weak, with economic relations primarily focused on official development assistance, or ODA. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that's somewhat correct in the sense that it is normal in a way that Africa still depends on foreign aid. And the simple reason is that most of the African countries are not able to, mobilize a significant amount of tax revenue, which is essential for public investment. So development assistance in a way is a kind of resource that help African government to supplement the deficit in terms of tax revenue. So now when it comes to the effectiveness of aid, that's a different question because there are different factors that intervene in terms of contributing to the positive effects of aid on economic development. So now when it comes to cooperation between South Korea and Africa, for example, it is true that aid remains the main, channel of engagement for Korea in Africa. So, for example, recent figures from the OECD suggest that in 2022, Korea delivered about 30% of its total aid to sub-Saharan Africa, but 20 years before, this amount represented less than 10%. So this shows you the importance of aid in the interaction between South Korea and Africa. But beside aid, it is good to mention that there are other canon of interaction between Korea and Africa. There are more and more trade between Korea and individual African countries, although when compared to trade between Korea and the rest of the world, the size for Africa remains insignificant, but I think the trend is somewhat positive. And there is also FDI coming from, Africa, mostly greenfield FDI that is, totally new investment from foreign investor. And I think things are going the right way, I would say. So there is aid, of course, but other means of interactions are also playing some important role in the interaction between South Korea and Africa.
So we're seeing a growing positive trend on that front. Professor Che, experts point out that Korea should adopt a differentiated strategy, being a latecomer in engaging with African nations. As Professor KATOKA pointed out, the competition is fierce. What strategies are needed for South Korea to make the country stand out among other competitors?
Yes, we are a latecomer, but we can still use our unique strengths by implementing several strategic initiatives that meet African needs. The first one is technology and innovation. Korea is a leader in technology, so it could share its expertise in telecommunication, IT, and electronics manufacturing to help develop Africa's digital infrastructure. Second one is education and also vocational training. Thus, Korea could set up educational and training centers to teach skills that are high demand in Africa, like digital technology, engineering, and healthcare. I think this would help promote a lasting relationship between Korean institutions and African communities. Lastly, the green technology. So using its expertise in green technology, Korea could implement a renewable energy project such as solar and wind energy in Africa. And this aligns with the global move towards sustainable development and also addresses the vital needs in the continent. So by focusing on these key areas, Korea can form a beneficial partnership with African nations, making it a favored ally of Africa, although we are relatively latecomer.
So technology and education are some areas that Korea can focus to meet the demands of African nations. Now, Professor KATOKA, what are your future prospects for South Korea-Africa cooperation, and in which direction should the two regions' partnership evolve?
I think that's a valid question. First of all, I think it's good to say that South Korea enjoys excellent reputation among the people and government of Africa. And one reason is Korea's past experience as one of the poorest countries. And Korea itself was once a recipient of development assistance. So many African countries see Korea as a model to benchmark. You know, that is one. And so, as I said earlier, African countries have high expectations in collaborating with Africa. So now, when it comes to the future of cooperation between Korea and Africa, what I see is that we should have two levels of cooperation. One at the regional level, you know, the African Union and, you know, all the African countries combined. Korea should have a strategy for cooperating with Africa as a region, not with individual countries. For example, cooperation could be directed towards, you know, contributing to building intra-country infrastructure, because that is one of the areas in which Africa has shortcomings, you know, infrastructure, you know, roads and so on. Korea could kind of concentrate on that. And then another level of cooperation is with individual countries, because different countries have different expectations from South Korea, and they have different needs. And one positive thing is that South Korea already has what is called the country partnership strategy. So in which South Korea kind of tailors its development assistance to countries based on their development needs. So maybe Korea should consider expanding that approach to a broader set of countries, deliver assistance or development assistance based on the needs of individual countries. So I think that is another area in which South Korea should direct its cooperation with Africa.
Well, Africa is on a solid path to play a much bigger role as a key player in global affairs in the future, and hopefully South Korea will be an excellent companion throughout the journey. Thank you so much, Professor KATOKA and Professor Che, for your expertise.
Thank you.
And that wraps up our show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back same time tomorrow.